Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Hey, that's really a very robust response. Thank you. Welcome to the 2016 Academic Convocation, which will be a great event for our whole college community. We have a very distinguished speaker, and I would make one request as the co-chair of the convocation. Please turn off all electronic devices. It's very great to have such a bright, intellectually inspired, and alert and awake, except for the one guy over here. He and I have been working on it. Everybody awake and ready to roll. On behalf of the committee, I would like to thank especially Dean Carmen Palumbo for his great work in organizing this event, and to Professor Jessica Palumbo and Professor Amanda McKenzie for working very diligently to obtain a National Endowment for the Arts Big Read grant that's allowed for us to have this celebration of literature and history and many other fields of inquiry as part of this, and helped us to reflect very deeply on an important topic and an important writer. So we welcome everyone here. It's a great honor to have you. This is a great event, and I would now like to introduce Dean Carmen Palumbo, Dean of the School of Humanities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cheek, for that introduction. I am here to introduce our convocation speaker, but I want to very briefly tell you about the process. Since Dr. Cheek and I have been chairing the academic convocation for about the past 3 years, this is our second actual convocation ceremony. The process is that we begin in the spring semester. Dr. Cheek and I will meet with Amanda McKenzie, also with Jessica Palumbo, who's been working with us on this, to talk about which books would be books that would be appropriate for an academic convocation. And the purpose of it is for us all to have read the same book at the beginning of each year with some ideas that we all would sort of have in common that year. And to kick off the academic year of 2016-2017 with sort of one common group of ideas and one common novel. So we put this out in a SurveyMonkey to the faculty, the entire faculty of the college on all 3 campuses. And this past year, the book that came back without question as the chosen book by the faculty of East Georgia State College, all of them, the English professors and the biology professors and the chemistry professors, was A Lesson Before Dying by Ernest Gaines. So that was clearly going to be the book, and once we had the book, we sat down and sketched out how we would put together the convocation. Amanda McKenzie and Jessica Palumbo took on the huge task of earning a National Endowment for the Arts grant called a Big Read grant to pay for a month-long series of activities, and I hope you all have been enjoying those activities. I hope everyone's gotten a free copy of A Lesson Before Dying. We've given out 750 copies of that text, and we've had a number of successful activities and events. But when we knew we had to have a convocation speaker, the question was, well, who should we get? And there was only one person on that list, and her name is Dr. Marcia Gaude, someone I've known for 20 plus years and who has been a friend of Ernest Gaines for a long, long time, for probably 30 plus years. Dr. Gaude is a professor of English Emerita at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, where she directed a number of doctoral dissertations, including my own. She was the Doris Merriweather Board of Regents Endowed Professor of English, a UL Lafayette Foundation Distinguished Professor, founding director of the Ernest J. Gaines Center, which is where all of his papers and a collection of his other work is there. A lot of artifacts are there as well. So if you are in Lafayette, Louisiana, you might want to stop by and visit the Gaines Center. She has published widely on Louisiana culture, folklore, and literature. Her publications include Porch Talk with Ernest Gaines, Conversations on the Writer's Craft, which was published in 1990. Also, This Louisiana Thing That Drives Me, The Legacy of Ernest J. Gaines in 2009. She was a visiting scholar at the 2016 NEH Summer Institute. Ernest Gaines and the Southern Experience. Her book, Carville, Remembering Leprosy in America, was awarded the 2005 Chicago Folklore Prize. Her other book publications include Tales from the Levee, Mardi Gras Gumbo and Zydeco, and Second Line Rescue, improvised responses to Katrina and Rita. She's a fellow of the American Folklore Society. So please introduce a great friend of mine, a wonderful scholar in person, Dr. Marcia Gaude.
Thank you, Carmen. It's a really pleasure to be here. There are a few things that I think more rewarding to a college professor than to have one of your former students invite you to come to speak at their school almost 20 years later. So it's a real pleasure to be here. And I also want to give you the greetings from Ernest Gaines. He was my colleague since 1981 at the University of Louisiana in Lafayette. And he's very pleased, very excited to hear how so many people here in Swainsboro, Georgia, are reading A Lesson Before Dying. I wanted to start off by going back to the year 1993 when A Lesson Before Dying was published. Ernest Gaines wasn't, of course, at Louisiana then. Dean Palumbo was also at UL, and of course, I had been a colleague of Gaines for a long time. When it was published, CNOP, as they usually do, especially if they think they're going to get colleges and schools to teach a book, they put out a study guide, and I just want to read to you one of the things that the study guide says. Here, and I'm quoting it. Gaines believes that black men in Louisiana have only 3 choices: to die violently, to be brought down to the level of beast, or to run and run. How does the way in which Gaines articulates these grim choices and suggests an alternative to them make A Lesson Before Dying applicable not only to Louisiana in 1948, but to the United States in the 1990s? Now, what they were saying is that when they published it in 1993, of course, it was still relevant. Now, for most of you in the audience, of course, you were not born in 1993, okay? So we'll just skip up, another 23 years. And again, ask that question, how is A Lesson Before Dying relevant in the 21st century? How is it relevant to us? And why do colleges, not only in the United States, but in many other countries in the world? That is, A Lesson Before Dying has been translated into 17 different languages. And it's taught in China, it's taught in France, it's taught in Slovenia. And of course, Slovenia, translation into Slovene, that, probably, unless you know a lot of languages, you probably don't know Slovene, but it is something that's being read by college and high school students there. And so the question, how is it that, somebody can write a book about one little area of Louisiana and make it interesting or make it relevant to people all over the world? And we might think about it, why does Gaines then decide to set it in 1948 in Louisiana? In fact, he didn't originally set it in 1948. Originally, when he started writing it, he was going to set it in the 1980s. Then he decided, no, he would go back, because the things that he wanted to write about, the details he wanted to give, he knew what people were like when he was growing up in Louisiana. He knew the foods that they ate. He knew how they were related to one another. And he also knew that that was a time of huge injustice in Louisiana, in most of the South. But it was also a place where he also had memories of people with dignity, people who had made a life for themselves. And he wanted to tell their story, that is, give a voice to people whose story had not been told. So he decided to back it up to 1940s, the 1948, and tell the story from there, okay? And the second thing, of course, things to remember, though it's set in Louisiana, it is set in the 1940s. So no, those things in the book, and hopefully you've read the book, and if you haven't, you really should do yourself a favor and read it, not only to get the themes and the things that you might discuss in class, but it is a really good book. And if you read through it and you get to the part that's called Jefferson's Diary, emotional, that you don't identify it, well, then you probably should have somebody take your pulse, because it is so emotionally powerful that, few people can be not affected by it, okay? But to remember that, no, those things, those exact things would not happen today. They're in 1940s, that was a different time. But also to remember that the world hasn't changed completely. There are still things that happen, as we well know if we look at the news, if we hear the news. Things are still happening, there are still injustices, there are still racial problems, there are still society problems. All of those things that he is talking about, we still can talk about today with a different set of circumstances. And like all great writers, all writers that we continue to read, 20 to 40 years, and in other cases like Faulkner or Tolstoy or others, a long time after they're dead, because they're transcending exactness of time and place. They're talking about what it means to be human, how humans can live together, find some meaning in their lives, and to ask those questions. Why do people continue to act as they do, and what are the alternatives to it, okay? Ernest Gaines came back to Louisiana, and the reason why he sets everything that he's ever written, except for one short story, in Louisiana, is that he says that's the place that he knew. He lived there until he was born in 1933, lived there until he was 15 years old, when his mother and stepfather sent him a ticket to come to California to meet them, because at that time in rural Louisiana, he did not have access to high school education, okay? And he says, in all my stories, no one ever escapes Louisiana. Maybe that is because my soul never left Louisiana, although my body did go to California. He came back to Louisiana to visit, and then finally he came back in 1983 and has been there at least part of the year ever since. Now, of course, gone back to the plantation where he grew up, bought part of the land and has a house there. But why does he write, why does he set them in Louisiana? Because that's what he knew. He could go into great detail about the people and be accurate. Now, we all know that there's a liability in reading fiction as though it were history or ethnography. Because if you have a writer who doesn't really know what he's talking about, then you can get some very false conceptions. That's not the case with Ernest Gaines. He lived that life, okay? And I want to just tell you something about the author, because I think knowing something about his life, in this case, that context does help you to appreciate and give meaning to what he writes. This is the earliest image that we have from the plantation that he grew up on, okay? He grew up in Oscar, Louisiana, which is even much smaller than Swainsboro. The town to him, Bayonne, in A Lesson Before Dying, was about the same size as Swainsboro. This was painted somewhere before the Civil War. Gaines knows that his grandparents' grandparents were on that plantation. They worked the fields. Of course, it was before the Civil War. He knows that his ancestors were slaves. He knows that they're buried in the plantation cemetery. When we were doing research for the Gaines Center, I got this picture and wanted to put it in some of the things that we had. And he said, well, that was okay. He liked that. But he said, that's not at all my memory. He said, this is sort of a, artistic expression of something, and it looks beautiful. He said, but it wasn't beautiful. Those people were cutting sugarcane. Okay? It doesn't show what they were going through. And so he didn't particularly see that as in any way something that, told the story of his people. Okay? Well, he was born in 1933. The earliest images, photographic images, were done in the Library of Congress. The Farm Administration Association in the 1930s went around to document places all over the country, and especially in the South. This is that same sugar house in 1935. It was no longer being used. As over his lifetime, things went into disuse, okay? This is a picture from about the 1930s of the cane being cut. That is, it was all done by hand. He said, working in the hot sun caused many people to be called to preach. It was very hard work, okay? And even though he was 15 when he left Louisiana, he had cut cane, he had picked cotton. And he said, and that's a great motivation, to get out of there and go to school. In the 1930s, here, these photographs from the plantation next to the one that he grew up on. Again, these are Library of Congress photographs. He doesn't have any photographs of his own family at that age because they didn't have a camera. But if you see the cabins in the background, that was the kind of, that was where he lived. He lived in an ex-slave cabin. He was raised by an aunt, a handicapped aunt who never walked, but a great influence on him. And looking at these, we can get some idea of not only what Ernest Gaines' life was, but what Jefferson's life would have been growing up at that time. If you look at the ages, yeah, Jefferson would have been a little bit before the 30s growing up. People sitting on the porch, a very Southern thing. If you notice in the book also the importance of musical instruments. By the time he left Louisiana, they did have electricity. But what he mainly remembers is studying and doing his homework by a coal oil lamp and having heat from the fireplace. But they did have musical instruments, and that was very much a part of his life. Ernest Gaines came back to Louisiana. In between, he went to San Francisco, finished high school, went to San Francisco State, and then was drafted into the Army. In the Army, he began to write. He had always wanted to write. He had always, tried to write a novel. In fact, he wrote the first one when he was a teenager. But after he had gone into the Army, came back, finished his degree, went on to Stanford and studied creative writing, and began to write One of the things that led him to realize that even though he had training as a writer, he needed to be back in touch with the people that he wanted to write about. And he says that what made him decide to come back to Louisiana in 1963, he was thinking about writing a book about a 100-year-old woman. And so he needed to know something about what things were like at that time. And he wanted to be back in touch with the people. And so he decided that this was a time to come back and visit. Even though there's certainly quite a bit of biographical, as all writers, they use part of their own experience in the book. Unlike Grant in A Lesson Before Dying, he did not have anybody that expected him to stay. His aunt had died. And so here, his story is not quite the same, is not the same as Jefferson's, but he could draw on some of those experiences. What brought him back to Louisiana in 1963 was the news that James Meredith had successfully challenged the legal segregation in attending the University of Mississippi at Oxford. Meredith had won for himself the right to an equal education in his home state, and Gaines took this as a sign that perhaps the South was beginning to change and to offer black young people the kind of learning that he had to leave to get. Okay, and he also understood that there was another kind of learning. It wasn't just the learning that you got in schools, but the learning that you got from simply listening to the people talking. And the title, Mozart and Leadbelly, he uses the idea that you not only needed the formal training, like the Mozart part of his writing, but you also need to have something to write about. You need something that you know very well. And he wanted to tell that story. He wanted to do it accurately. So he came back in 1963 mainly to visit, spent 6 months living near the people that he had grown up with. Okay? He has said the most important moves he ever made in his life, as far as his life and his career, was leaving Louisiana in 1948 and then coming back in 1963. And from that 6 months, basically, he started writing A Lesson Before Dying, the autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. Okay. Here, just to give you, again, some context, this is the house, the plantation house, where his grandmother was the cook. Okay. He worked in the yard picking pecans, picking eggs and things like that. And if you've read the book, you know that what he's describing there of Grant talking about his own childhood were things that Gaines himself had done. When he came back in the 1960s, he took pictures of the quarters. This is a row of houses that was still there in the 1960s, and that's where his family lived. This is a picture of the house that he grew up in. By that time, no one was living in there, but you can see that when he talks about things in the quarters, he's really drawing on his own experience. Okay? Not unlike the children in A Lesson Before Dying, Gaines' early schooling took place in the plantation church. And like Grant, he had a teacher who came for about 5 months during the year to teach on the plantation, okay? And that school went up to 8th grade, okay? There were still people on the plantation who were cutting sugar cane. Some other images that he took, for example, a live oak that he writes about in Miss Jane Pittman, and the oak in the 1980s. And here another picture of that plantation church. And you can tell in the 1980s, when he got the idea of writing about someone who who had been executed for a murder he didn't commit, okay? He wanted to tell not only the story of the injustice, but he wanted to see, how would somebody react to that? How would the people who knew him and who love him would react to that? So he came back again, and by that time he was teaching in Louisiana. Do you notice the air conditioning unit? They certainly didn't have that in the 1940s, but by that time, at least, the church was air conditioned. He also, the graveyard had been neglected. By the 80s, no one was living in the slave quarters, the ex-slave quarters anymore. And that was all the more why he wanted to tell that story, why he wanted to put it in the 1940s. That is, it was a story about people that he thought was important to tell, that you had to know sort of what those people went through. And so he came back to tell the story and get a more recent picture of that graveyard. But part of his motivation to write was that that world had ended on the plantation. Unfortunately, for many of the people who left the plantation, they had no training to do any other kind of work. Gaines has said if he had not left in 1948 and gone to California, that he would probably either be dead or in jail. He said because there were no opportunities there, that he was one of the fortunate ones who could go away, go to college. And so again, he was like Grant in that he went away. And so why does he tell Grant's story? And what do we get from Grant's story? I'll just leave this up on the screen while I'm talking. This is a picture of the guide to the NEA Big Read, which, by the way, Ernest Gaines does not like at all. He does. Caricatures, I think, often are not things that people particularly like. But if you've seen, the Big Read, and I don't know if they're still giving those out, but that picture is on the website, and it's on all the places where they're teachers' guides and various other things, okay? But when we look at, the story, we see what has happened. Gaines says, I came from a place where people sat around and chewed sugarcane and roasted sweet potatoes and peanuts in the ashes, and sat on ditch banks and towed tales, and sat on porches and went into the swamp, went into the fields. That's what I come from. With all the themes that we see in A Lesson Before Dying, one of the things that may have struck you, maybe not, is how much he talks about food. And in fact, in every chapter, there's a mention of food. And we usually think of food, not as a political thing, but as he uses it, because food is something that we think of as bringing people together, the food that the people eat sort of is a transcultural Louisiana thing. That is, whether you're Creole, Cajun, African American, you probably grow up eating those same kind of food. So we have the illusion that this all brings people together. And yet, how does Grant first feel totally excluded? How is he humiliated? Okay, by excluding him from the dinner table, okay? He is made to wait in the kitchen while the sheriff, the white men, are eating. And he says, when he left the plantation, he didn't think that he would ever allow himself to be humiliated in such a way. But he comes back not because he wants to, but because he feels responsibility. He feels that he owes something to his aunt, And later, of course, he's very much influenced by his girlfriend, by Vivian. And so he does something that usually we think of as something, more positive, and yet it's used, for Grant at least, in a very negative way. But then he finds an alternative to that. He uses the food to bring Jefferson around, because Jefferson is in jail. I'm going to assume you've read the book, or you're going to read it, so I won't summarize it for you. But of course, Jefferson's accused of a murder that he didn't commit. Grant is sent to, quote, try to make him a man before he dies, because his defense attorney, and I think in just a colossal irony, the person who's trying to defend him refers to him as a hog. That is, he takes away his humanity. And that's what his Nanan, or his godmother, wants Grant to change. Okay? And when he knows he's reached Jefferson is when Jefferson agrees to eat the food. That is, what can somebody who's condemned to death for something he didn't do, what does he owe to anybody? And as Grant says, you owe it to your Nanan. She loves you, if for no other reason. And so he uses that to try to, in some way, connect with Jefferson as a person, as a human being. Okay? I want to then go to some of the other themes. And if you look at the themes in A Lesson Before Dying, certainly one of the most important, is Gaines' themes of personal responsibility throughout his writings, that responsibility, taking responsibility for your own decisions, for your own actions. But also what many scholars have called survival with dignity. And here again, a tremendous irony, because Jefferson is not going to survive. That is, the injustice is such that they don't even try to change the verdict. But he at least will get to die. I'm going to skip over some things because I realize that time is kind of getting a little bit short, and I want to kind of have a little bit of time for discussion, okay? One of the things that's very imperative, what is the narrative? And if you've watched the movie O.J. Simpson, The People versus O.J. Simpson, you saw at least dramatically depicted, and for those of us who actually remember the trial, so much depended upon which attorney would tell the best story, that is, the story that the jury would believe. And we see the same thing sort of happening with A Lesson Before Dying, except that the attorneys were not very good. That is, the story that he selected simply didn't work, okay? But I just wanted to, again, here you have it set in the African-American community. He's been condemned to death. His aunt is not so much trying to change the verdict, but to change, really, the story about him. The attorney, of course, refers to him as a hog, that the only argument for his innocence is that he was like an animal, that he was not capable of, planning and committing a murder. And this storytelling dimension of law and social justice is the central issue in A Lesson Before Dying. The competing stories told in the courtroom during Jefferson's trial for murder reflect the norms and expectations of those in power, the prosecutor and the court-appointed defense attorney. And remember here, we are in 1940 in that book. The prosecutor, the defense attorney, all the members of the jury were white males, okay? And so there was no jury of his peers. There was no one representing him or representing what, his beliefs and his culture were, okay? Of course, the court-appointed attorney attempts a defense that excludes Jefferson from the human race. Jefferson's real peers have no language to articulate the complexity of what they know to be an accurate reflection of what happened. As legal critics and scholars have noted, the plaintiff and the defendant in trial each tell a story, translating the, quote, real story into legal narrative, okay? And here we can see what happens with Grant, okay? When he is able to reach Jefferson in his conflict with the minister, he doesn't believe, he has no faith, and so it's very hard for him to try to base any kind of reaching Jefferson on faith. But he does know that Jefferson, or he finds out that Jefferson is interested in music. And so the radio is sort of his first introduction into connecting with him as a person, as a human being. And then, of course, he gets the idea of the journal, okay, which was something fairly late in the book. It's the only chapter in the book that has a title. It's also the only chapter in the book that's not narrated by the teacher, by Grant, okay? Here, this person who is semi-illiterate, that is, he's never written a letter in his life, he's never tried to express his thoughts philosophically in any way. So he writes with no punctuation, he spells phonetically, he expresses his thoughts, though. As one critic said, his writing comes from deep down in a place that transcends law and society, okay? That he is writing to express his own thoughts, and he becomes not just a person, a worker on a plantation, he becomes someone who begins to assess what has happened and the meaning of his life. He also realizes, that he doesn't want to hurt his Nanan, his godmother. And what's, I think, astounding, because he is not guilty, but he takes some responsibility for his actions. He says, I shouldn't have gone with them. I knew they weren't good. Okay? And so in this transcendence, the narrative changes. Okay? And here, coming back to that, how can you react to something that is so unjust, that is so, that there is no way to get past that? Okay? And Gaines is not saying, he's not suggesting that there is one answer, or that there is something, he's not giving us all the answers, but he is saying that part of being a culture, a society, a community, is to come together, okay? To come together and in some way to try to find an alternative to what's happening. And it struck me this morning as I was listening to the news and reading, and thinking about talking about all the things that Gaines says in A Lesson Before Dying, about storytelling and about how Nanan is really asking Grant to intercede on a narrative fallacy. She is saying that's not the right story, okay? Not even, it's his own defense lawyer, but he's saying, he's not a hog. I want you to change that. So instead, even though he's executed, he becomes a hero because he dies with dignity. He walks to his execution, okay? In fact, the line, "Tell Nanan I walked," okay, that he faced it was the only thing that he could give to her to repay her for what she had given to him, okay? But beginning with, as we began as I started, what happens in a situation, where there's the injustice is done? How do you react to it? And what can people do? And again, that message, continue to look for an alternative, something that will get us past this. And I might mention that one of your faculty members, Dr. Ren Denton, is doing work on, in fact, she talked earlier this week about using a lesson before dying to teach Black Lives Matter, to use it as a key for discussion. And as I was listening to the news this morning about the shooting, another shooting in Charlottesville, North Carolina, Charlotte, North Carolina, I was struck by what the black police chief said. It's a complex situation, more complex than we've seen in all the tragedies that occurred, because, first of all, two narratives, and the police chief even says there are stories out there that aren't true. And the complexity is that the man who was shot was black, the policeman who shot him was black, the police chief was black. Here, again, it becomes, there's not an easy answer, okay? But the police chief said, it's time to change the narrative. Again, narratives, the stories we tell, do affect people. We're affected not only by what really happened, we're affected by stories about what happened, okay? And sometimes, the one that holds the most sway is simply the story that is most believable, that people can relate to, okay? And the emotional effect of it. The other thing that the policeman said, and again, that sort of irony and complexity, the two stories, one, that the man who was shot had a book, and the other one is that he had a gun. And again, that complexity of the sort of conflicting narratives. And the policeman said it's time for the voiceless majority to be heard. I can't say that what the police chief is saying is that we need to continue to look at ways to solve society's problems. But the question, is a lesson before dying still relevant, okay? All those things, narratives, what people say, not what happens, certainly, the injustices where people simply can't take it anymore, but also perhaps the additional tragedy of the story being told that causes even more violence, okay? And so I think, again, read the book because it's a great book and you'll really enjoy it. But also because there's so much to think about in it, and there's so much, maybe it doesn't give you the answers, but it certainly can start a conversation. And just a couple of more things, and then we'll stop, and if you have some questions. Insight into why a writer does something. If you've read the book, can you have any idea why? Oh, I'll go back to this one because you notice up on the upper right, there's a butterfly there. Do you remember where there's a butterfly in A Lesson Before Dying? Okay. In the South, of course, the butterfly, not only the South, but in many places, is often a symbol of the soul or the presence, the return of something, someone that you loved, or someone who has passed on, and a butterfly sort of randomly appearing. Gaines used that because he was in the cemetery. He doesn't know where his aunt was buried because he was in California. There were unmarked graves, or sometimes they were marked with wood, which of course floods and hurricanes, the wood doesn't last long. He doesn't know where she's buried. But when he was visiting the cemetery, the butterfly kept going right to this path of grass that was right near him. He took a picture of it and then used that for that, and it's on page 251, 252, for the whole scene of Grant realizing that it was over for Jefferson, that he was no longer there, but makes a commitment to tell the story. Okay? Gaines moved the church school that he attended to his backyard. The plantation was going to tear it down. And so now it's still there, sort of as, again, that circle, a successful author who came back. He's 83. He can't be out doing the kinds of things that perhaps a younger person could to change society, but he can still do it through his books and through his works. Okay. Any questions or any, either about my talk or about Ernest Gaines or the book? Okay, thank you. And again, I hope you read the book. I hope you enjoy it.